Let's get into the story. The steady hum of the archival room in downtown Toronto was like a lullaby to Jessica Pascal's soul. Dust floated gently through beams of filtered sunlight, illuminating the worn spines of centuries-old manuscripts and rare leather-bound journals that lined the shelves. This was her sanctuary, an obscure corner of the city's historical preservation center that most people didn't even know existed. Jessica, a woman in her early 30s with calm brown eyes and softly curled auburn hair always pulled into a low knot, had worked here for nearly 8 years. She rarely ventured outside the routine of restoring documents, cataloging endangered records, and sipping lukewarm tea while classical music played faintly through her headphones. Her life was simple, quiet, and honest, nothing flashy, nothing broken. At least, not on the surface. Jessica's upbringing had shaped her into a woman who found peace in silence and resilience in repetition. Raised in the outskirts of Halifax by her great-aunt Mildred after her parents' sudden death in a boating accident, Jessica had learned from an early age to appreciate the little things: warm porridge on winter mornings, the sound of turning pages, and the predictability of library hours. She was a woman of substance, not sparkle. In a world driven by speed, Jessica moved slowly. Where others sought applause, she found joy in being unseen. It wasn't that she lacked ambition, she just didn't crave validation. Her dream had always been to preserve history, to give voices to the forgotten, and protect the fragile whispers of those long gone. The quiet made sense to her, it was where she listened best. Outside the archive, Jessica's life was much the same, modest, organized, and unbothered by extravagance. She lived in a small studio apartment above a flower shop owned by a sweet older couple who often left her leftover bouquets. Her wardrobe was filled with muted cardigans and long skirts. Her hobbies were simple: reading classic literature, journaling, and weekend walks through the Royal Ontario Museum gardens. She had only a handful of friends, mostly fellow archivists and a neighbor named Loretta who shared her love for tea and thrifted puzzles. Though her life seemed uneventful to some, it was full of integrity. Jessica didn't chase after men, wealth, or attention. She valued honesty, humility, and the comforting order of her routines. But fate, ever the unpredictable author, was already turning the page on the life Jessica thought she would always lead. Daniel Mark walked through the glass doors of Argente's Consulting in downtown Vancouver like he owned every inch of the marble floors. Tall, athletic, and always sharply dressed in tailored navy suits with pocket squares that never repeated, Daniel had a charisma that turned heads the moment he entered a room. His co-workers described him as magnetic, clients trusted him instantly. But beneath the charm and smooth smiles was a man who studied every move with ruthless precision. Born to a struggling single mother in a small Nova Scotia fishing town, Daniel had tasted poverty and promised himself he would never go back. He wasn't chasing comfort, he was chasing control. He wanted power that couldn't be taken, wealth that silenced every childhood humiliation, and influence that made people remember his name long after he left the room. Daniel's hunger for advancement wasn't driven by passion but by vengeance, a quiet rebellion against the years he spent sharing one winter coat with his younger brother, begging for extra shifts at the town's pier, and listening to his mother cry behind a thin wooden wall when the landlord came knocking. While other children played outside, Daniel read business journals in the school library, mimicking how CEOs spoke in interviews and memorizing the metrics of success. He was smart, not in the academic sense. He didn't care much for textbooks, but in the way predators are smart. He could read people like markets, calculate their weaknesses, and use charm as a blade masked in velvet. At 32, Daniel had clawed his way into middle management at Argente's and was already eyeing the vice president's office. But there was one thing still slowing him down: status. He had the look, the voice, and the drive. What he lacked was the image of a grounded, stable man. A wife. Jessica Pascal was never his type. She was quiet, bookish, and unimpressive by society's standards. But that was exactly why Daniel noticed her. At a cultural exhibition in Toronto, one he only attended to impress a client, he spotted her standing beside a 17th-century globe, explaining its origin to a small crowd of tourists. She was elegant in a way that didn't demand attention, and Daniel saw opportunity. She would never outshine him. She was smart enough to carry conversation but humble enough not to steal it. Most importantly, she was invisible to the type of people who could make or break reputations, meaning she was safe. In Jessica, Daniel saw not a partner, but a prop. Someone to complete the illusion of the perfect man. The moment he approached her with that perfect smile and his Oxford-polished charm, he had already calculated everything: her schedule, her salary, her emotional disposition. To Daniel, love was irrelevant. Jessica was the next step in his climb. Jessica stood before the mirror in her modest apartment, smoothing the front of her ivory knee-length dress with trembling hands. There was no grand cathedral, no sprawling guest list, no satin veil or bridal procession. Just a quiet civil ceremony scheduled at the municipal courthouse on a chilly Tuesday morning. And yet, her heart fluttered with cautious hope. Daniel had proposed 3 weeks earlier over dinner at a quiet bistro. The words had caught her off guard, served between sips of red wine and flickering candlelight. "I want a future with someone like you," he had said. Someone like her. Jessica had never been someone men rushed to marry, and Daniel's sudden certainty had overwhelmed her. He had made her feel seen, valued. In her heart, she had longed for love, for permanence. So when he slipped a modest ring onto her finger and kissed her hand, she didn't question the speed. She said yes. The ceremony was brief. A court official read vows neither of them wrote, and Jessica signed her name with a shy smile as Daniel kept glancing at his watch. There were no family members present. Daniel claimed his mother was ill, and Jessica, estranged from most of her relatives, hadn't invited anyone. Afterward, he hailed a car and took her to a hotel suite downtown, where they shared champagne and stared out at the skyline in silence. Jessica convinced herself it was romantic. Daniel, on the other hand, was already planning his next networking event. The ring on his hand was a symbol to his superiors, proof that he was maturing, grounding himself, presenting the image of a reliable man. He spoke often about how marriage would help him be taken more seriously. Jessica assumed he meant it in a good way. She didn't realize she was the chess piece that sealed his corporate image. In the weeks that followed, Daniel's mask remained intact. He took her to art events, held her hand at fundraisers, and kissed her cheek for cameras. But behind closed doors, his warmth cooled. He was often distracted, missing dinner, claiming late meetings and impromptu travel. Jessica tried to stay supportive. She believed in marriage, and patience, and building a future together. She packed his lunches, ironed his shirts, and waited up for him with soft jazz playing and candles lit. But Daniel wasn't looking for love. He was looking for leverage. Each time he introduced her to colleagues, it was never "my wife, Jessica," but "Jessica, she's into history," or "she works in archives." Jessica began to feel like an accessory to his ambitions, not a partner. And yet, she stayed, unaware that this marriage was never meant to be a sanctuary. It was a transaction. One she had walked into with a heart full of love, and he with a ledger of gain. Annabelle Briggs didn't believe in limits, especially not when it came to getting what she wanted. At 29, she was one of the top-performing luxury real estate agents in downtown Vancouver, known for selling waterfront penthouses and modern estates to the elite. Her fashion was precise, her perfume unmistakable, and her reputation both feared and envied. She drove a matte black Porsche and lived in a high-rise where her balcony overlooked the harbor. But beneath the curated elegance was a woman who hunted advantage like a seasoned predator. Men were never a mystery to her. They were either buyers, tools, or trophies, and Daniel Mark fit 2 of those categories. She first spotted him at an executive development seminar hosted at one of her listings, where he stood near the bar in a sharp gray suit, sipping whiskey with the confidence of a man who knew he wasn't at the top but was determined to get there. That hunger intrigued her. Annabelle approached him first, silk red dress, effortless stride, eyes like questions he didn't know how to answer. Their conversation flowed easily. She asked about his goals, listened intently, and complimented his drive. She didn't need to flirt, her presence did the work. She knew men like Daniel were drawn to power cloaked in beauty. Within weeks, they were meeting secretly. At first, it was flirty lunches and private lounges, then weekends at discreet resorts under the guise of business. Daniel, already growing cold toward Jessica, found in Annabelle a mirror to his ambition. She challenged him, teased him, and fed his ego. Where Jessica offered quiet support, Annabelle offered fire. But it wasn't just chemistry. Annabelle saw potential in Daniel. He could be molded, pushed, and used. And she wanted more than a fling. She wanted elevation. She wanted his name on a deed that matched hers. As their affair deepened, Annabelle began playing her cards. She planted seeds of doubt in Daniel's mind about his marriage. "You need a woman who complements your vision," she'd whisper. "Someone who turns heads beside you, not fades behind you." Her words struck him like gospel. The more she elevated herself in his eyes, the more Jessica seemed like dead weight. "Your wife doesn't belong in the world you're building," Annabelle said one night, draped in cashmere sheets, head resting on his chest. "You're meant for more." That was the night Daniel first considered what it would take to start over. And Annabelle, watching him with calculating eyes, knew her game was working. Slowly, deliberately, she was pulling the strings that would unravel Jessica's quiet life, until the only woman left standing beside Daniel Mark was her. The first time Daniel made Jessica feel small, it was with a sigh. She had spent the evening preparing a quiet dinner to celebrate his recent promotion: rosemary chicken, steamed vegetables, his favorite French wine. When he walked in and saw the table set, candles flickering and soft piano music playing, he didn't smile. He simply sighed, took off his coat, and said, "You don't need to try this hard. It's not that serious." Jessica blinked, unsure how to respond. She brushed it off, convincing herself he was tired. But it didn't stop there. Soon, his coldness became routine. He would return home late without explanation, speak to her in clipped tones, and barely looked up from his phone when she talked. Jessica, still trying to hold their marriage together, wrote notes in his briefcase, sent him midday texts, and tried new dishes. But Daniel never responded. The warmth that once existed in brief moments had been replaced by a sharp, invisible chill. Over time, his words became blades. He criticized her clothing, called her plain and unimpressive. When she suggested attending a historical symposium together, he scoffed. "Who wants to sit through that academic crap? No one cares about dead people's letters." He never introduced her to his colleagues anymore, and if they were in the same room, he referred to her only as Jess. "Not my wife. Just Jess." And it stung more than she could admit. On weekends, when she tried to plan outings or even quiet evenings at home, Daniel often said he had work, yet photos would surface online of him attending networking mixers and high-end parties. When Jessica confronted him gently, he shrugged. "You wouldn't fit in anyway. They're not your kind of crowd." That sentence echoed in her heart like a thunderclap. Her kind of crowd. It was becoming clear, he no longer saw her as a partner, but as someone who no longer served a purpose. The emotional bruises didn't leave physical marks, but Jessica began to feel them in the way she moved, the way she dressed, the way her voice grew softer when Daniel was around. She avoided speaking unless spoken to, stopped buying new clothes, and returned home to silence more nights than not. Her journals, once filled with literary quotes and museum reflections, now held questions she never dared to ask aloud. What changed? Why am I not enough? When did I become invisible? Friends at work began to notice the dullness in her eyes. Loretta, her neighbor, once asked if everything was okay. Jessica smiled and said yes. But the truth was this: she was slowly vanishing inside her own marriage. And Daniel, encouraged by Annabelle's growing whispers, was no longer hiding his disdain. He had begun rehearsing a different life, and Jessica, without knowing it, was being erased from the script. The Grand Europa Hotel in Milan shimmered under the golden glow of chandeliers as the International Business Gala commenced. It was an evening reserved for CEOs, diplomats, and executives who dictated the future of global commerce. Jessica stood at Daniel's side in a navy gown she had purchased on clearance, her hair swept into a simple bun, her heart pounding with both awe and anxiety. She had never been to Europe, never imagined herself walking into a ballroom filled with people whose names adorned magazine covers. Daniel had barely spoken to her on the flight, and since their arrival, he had left her alone for hours while he attended pre-gala meetings. Tonight was supposed to be different. He had insisted she accompany him, even arranged a last-minute ticket. Jessica hoped, naively, that this was his way of rekindling the connection they had lost. But the moment they stepped into the gala, Daniel distanced himself. He greeted colleagues with enthusiasm, laughed freely with glamorous women in sequined gowns, and introduced himself as if he were alone. Jessica lingered near the edge of the room, sipping water, trying not to feel misplaced among the glittering crowd. At one point, she tried to join a conversation he was having with 3 executives from Zurich. She placed a gentle hand on his arm and smiled. "I was just telling them about our museum visit last month," she said softly. Daniel's expression froze. Then, with a cruel chuckle that drew attention, he replied, "Don't mind Jessica, she thinks old paintings are the same as market trends." "Adorable, isn't it?" Laughter followed. Jessica's cheeks burned. She tried to retreat gracefully, but Daniel wasn't done. "Some of us deal in real influence. You know, things that matter." Whispers rippled. A few guests exchanged awkward glances, and one woman gave Jessica a look of pity. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She stood frozen as Daniel raised his glass and toasted to power over poetry. It wasn't just a jab. It was an execution, delivered with a smile, surrounded by people who watched her shrink but said nothing. That night, as she sat alone in the hotel suite, staring out over the glowing Milan skyline, Jessica finally felt the weight of what her marriage had become. Not just broken, but weaponized. Daniel hadn't just embarrassed her. He had declared her irrelevant on a global stage. And while she lay curled on the edge of the king-sized bed, her phone buzzed with news alerts and tagged photos. The world might forget, but the internet wouldn't. The disgrace was public. The hurt, unforgettable. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, tucked between a package of archival documents and her monthly subscription to a literary journal. Jessica didn't recognize the handwriting, but her name was elegantly scrawled across the front in blue ink. She didn't open it immediately. She placed it on her kitchen counter beside the electric kettle, believing it to be something routine, perhaps a note from one of the preservation societies she occasionally volunteered with. It wasn't until after her evening shower, dressed in flannel and ready to wind down with a novel, that she finally tore the seal. Her fingers trembled as her eyes scanned the bolded heading, "Notice of Intent to Divorce." She blinked, rereading the first line over and over, her chest tightening. Her heart thudded painfully in her ears as she dropped onto the nearest chair, breath caught in her throat. There was no conversation. No warning. Just paperwork. Attached was a brief, cold letter from Daniel. He cited emotional incompatibility, irreconcilable priorities, and a closing line that pierced her more deeply than anything that had come before. "I need a partner who can contribute more than outdated values and a barren future." Barren. The word echoed like a curse. They had never tried for children. Jessica had once brought up the idea, gently, during their second year of marriage. Daniel had waved it off, saying it wasn't the right time. Now, he was turning the absence of children into a weapon. She felt the shame rush over her like ice water, an accusation wrapped in legal language, slicing deeper than any knife. But it wasn't just the papers. It was the silence. He hadn't called, hadn't even had the decency to deliver it in person. The man she married had vanished long ago. What remained was cold strategy. In the days that followed, Jessica moved like a ghost. She showed up to work, answered questions, filed documents, and smiled through tight lips. She didn't tell Loretta. She didn't tell her manager. At night, she lay on her bed staring at the ceiling, her mind playing scenes from Milan on a loop. Then came the final sting. Photos surfaced online, Daniel and Annabelle, arm in arm, attending an elite gala in San Francisco. The timing was unmistakable. The divorce papers hadn't been a sudden decision. He had been planning it. Jessica wasn't just being discarded, she was being replaced. And now, labeled barren, used, and unfit, her once silent world turned into a prison of whispers. She didn't respond to the letter. She didn't fight it. She simply signed where instructed, packed a single suitcase, and vanished from the life she had once fought to protect. Not with noise, but with silence sharper than any scream. The chill of Montreal in early autumn bit through Jessica's thin coat as she stepped off the Greyhound bus at the Central Terminal. She clutched her duffel bag to her chest, her only belongings folded and stacked inside with surgical care. There had been no farewell from Toronto, no dramatic exit, just a quiet resignation to leave a city that now haunted her with memories of betrayal. She had withdrawn the last of her savings, barely enough for a bus ticket and 3 nights in a low-cost hostel. The rest of her funds had been consumed by legal fees, rent arrears, and the final months of pretending her life wasn't unraveling. Montreal was unfamiliar territory. She had no friends here, no family, and no job. But she had silence, and to Jessica, that was something. The kind of silence that allows healing to begin, even if slowly, painfully, and in the dark. By the third night, her funds had dwindled to coins. With nowhere to go, she sat on a bench outside the metro station, watching lights blur through tear-filled eyes. The cold ground beneath her feet served as a harsh reminder that she no longer belonged anywhere. She hadn't told anyone where she was going, not even Loretta. There had been no goodbye texts, no social media posts. She had deleted everything. Her old life didn't exist anymore, and maybe that was how it was meant to be. She wandered the city the next morning, stomach growling, scanning storefront windows for hiring signs. Her resume meant little here. The historical institutions required fluency in French, references, and time, none of which she had. Eventually, she stumbled into a modest hotel tucked between two cafes on Rue Saint-Hubert. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, functional, and anonymous. She approached the front desk and, with her voice barely above a whisper, asked if there were any cleaning positions available. The manager, a short and stoic man named André Bouchard, looked her over with weary eyes. Jessica didn't look like a woman fit for physical labor, but desperation etched her features. He told her they had just lost a night cleaner. The job was 6 nights a week, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., with minimal pay and no benefits. Jessica accepted without hesitation. That night, she scrubbed toilets, vacuumed hallways, and stripped bed linens with trembling fingers. Her hands bled by morning. She worked quietly, speaking only when spoken to. Co-workers whispered about her, wondering what a woman like that was doing here. But Jessica never explained. Every night she put on the gray uniform and went floor by floor, erasing other people's messes. In those dark hours between dusk and dawn, she began to reclaim something, perhaps not hope, not yet, but the faintest thread of endurance. Her name was forgotten. Her history discarded. But Jessica Pascal, the woman who had been erased, was slowly learning how to rebuild, one floor at a time. It was just after 5 a.m. when Jessica began her final rounds on the 10th floor of the Imperial Allura Hotel. Her arms ached from stripping linens and disinfecting tiles all night, and her back throbbed from pushing the cleaning cart over plush carpets. The halls were quiet, only the distant hum of the HVAC system and the occasional elevator ding broke the stillness. Most guests were still asleep, and Jessica preferred it that way. Her shift was ending, and the sooner she could slip into anonymity and solitude, the better. But as she turned a corner near Suite 1007, a sharp sound broke the silence, a crash, like glass shattering against tile, followed by a thud. Jessica froze. Her instinct told her to mind her business, but something deeper, perhaps the part of her that had been ignored for too long, moved her feet. She reached the suite door and knocked gently. "Hello," she called. No response. She hesitated, then tried the handle. It was unlocked. What she found inside would change everything. On the floor of the marble-tiled bathroom lay an elderly woman in a silk robe, unconscious, a glass of water spilled beside her. Jessica rushed to her side, checking for a pulse. It was faint, but steady. Thinking quickly, she folded a towel beneath the woman's head, turned her gently onto her side, and reached for the emergency line on the hotel phone. Within minutes, hotel security and medics arrived. Jessica stayed until the woman was stabilized and wheeled away. She didn't know who she had helped. She just knew someone needed her. Later that day, long after her shift ended and she had retreated to the staff locker room, a concierge found her folding her uniform. "You're wanted in Suite 1007, he said. Jessica blinked, startled. When she arrived, 2 sharply dressed security agents stood guard at the door. Inside stood a man in a dark blue suit, tall and poised, with the composure of someone used to being watched. Jessica recognized him from television. President Joshua Kelvin, leader of the United States. He was in Canada for an international trade summit, and the woman she had helped was his mother, Margaret Kelvin, who had insisted on traveling with him despite her fragile health. "You stayed with her," Joshua said quietly, gratitude in his eyes. "You helped when others would have walked away." Jessica stood frozen, overwhelmed. She didn't know it yet, but this brief act of compassion, quiet, unseen, and without agenda, was about to rewrite the story of her life. And for the first time in months, someone looked at her not as a burden, but as someone extraordinary. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Jessica arrived at the lobby of the Imperial Allura Hotel the following morning, her uniform crisply ironed, though her eyes still bore the weight of exhaustion. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts kept returning to the previous day, the surreal moment when President Joshua Kelvin had spoken to her, not with condescension, not with pity, but with measured respect. She had expected the moment to pass, a polite acknowledgement and nothing more. But later that evening, a formal letter was hand-delivered to the staff wing bearing the presidential seal. Jessica opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a personal note from President Kelvin, thanking her for her courage and integrity, followed by an unexpected offer, a temporary assignment at the U.S. Embassy in Montreal, assisting in curatorial work for an upcoming historical exhibit. It felt like fiction. She read the letter over and over, unsure if she was dreaming. Jessica's instincts told her to decline. She hadn't curated anything in months, not since her life had imploded. She felt too broken, too stained, too invisible for such an opportunity. But something about Joshua's words, "Grace like yours is rare. It deserves room to shine," whispered a truth she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Perhaps she wasn't as irreparably discarded as Daniel made her believe. The next morning, she stood before the embassy gates, clutching a borrowed blazer and her resume tucked inside a folder. The building was pristine, guarded yet welcoming, and she was escorted by an aide to the fourth floor, where a modest cultural division office had been repurposed for the exhibit. Jessica was met by a petite curator named Elise Marquette, a bilingual firecracker of a woman who shook her hand and said, "I heard you saved the first mother's life. You've earned more than a seat at this table." For the first time in months, Jessica felt her mind awaken. Her hands, once used to scrub floors, now flipped through fragile historical documents and curated correspondence from post-war archives. Her voice, which had grown timid from emotional bruises, began to return. She contributed ideas, offered translations, and built timelines with the same quiet brilliance she had once poured into forgotten manuscripts back in Toronto. She didn't see Joshua Kelvin much, only brief glimpses when he visited his mother, but each time, he acknowledged her with a subtle nod or a knowing smile. He wasn't just intrigued by her composure, he was watching her reclaim herself without even trying. Jessica, unaware of how much she was already beginning to change, didn't see herself the way others now did. But something within her had shifted. This wasn't just a job. This was the rebirth of her identity. The embassy's cultural wing was never meant to be a place for romance. It was a quiet space lined with history books, aged parchment, and echoing silence, a realm of diplomacy and preservation, not affection. And yet, within that realm, Jessica Pascal moved with a grace that slowly disrupted President Joshua Kelvin's carefully ordered world. Their encounters were brief at first, passing nods in the corridor, a polite exchange of morning greetings, or a simple, "How is your mother today, sir?" But there was something in Jessica's eyes, steadiness, sorrow, and strength, that Joshua couldn't ignore. Unlike the women he was used to in political circles, sharp-tongued, agenda-driven, perpetually posturing, Jessica made no attempt to impress him. She simply was. Her presence was quiet but firm, her mind quick, and her compassion effortless. The more he observed her, the more he realized she was the calm he never knew he needed. Joshua had grown up in a world where every interaction was calculated, every relationship assessed for its political advantage. Even before he became president, he'd learned to view people through the lens of purpose. But Jessica never sought anything from him. She didn't ask for favors, never lingered too long when he entered a room, and certainly never pretended to be impressed by his power. In fact, he often noticed how she avoided the spotlight altogether, preferring to stay behind exhibits, focused on curation rather than conversation. That only intrigued him more. So he began seeking excuses to visit the exhibit in progress, asking questions about the material, requesting her insights on historical parallels, even commenting on her handwriting. With each visit, their exchanges grew warmer, more familiar. One day, over tea in the embassy garden, they found themselves laughing over a misprinted museum pamphlet. That moment, unassuming and soft, was the beginning. Their romance bloomed in the shadows of marble halls and under the cover of diplomacy. Joshua invited her to lunch in the staff cafeteria instead of lavish dinners. They shared private walks through embassy corridors after hours, where laughter and stories replaced politics and pretense. Jessica remained cautious. She was still healing, still unsure of her worth. But Joshua was patient. He never rushed her, never pressed. He simply showed up, reliably, respectfully, and fully. He asked about her past without judgment, and listened when she spoke of literature, of archives, of dreams long buried beneath betrayal. He admired not just her beauty, but the layers of resilience that made her glow from within. Slowly, Jessica's guard began to fall. She smiled more freely, dressed with subtle elegance, and let her laughter echo more often. And though no headlines announced it, and no cameras captured it, something undeniable was unfolding, two wounded souls, finding quiet healing in each other's presence. The chapel sat nestled between quiet vineyards on the outskirts of Geneva, far from the grandeur of official government halls or opulent cathedral weddings that normally defined presidential unions. It was a place Joshua Kelvin had visited years ago during a diplomatic retreat, a sanctuary where time seemed to pause and privacy was respected like scripture. The air was crisp, the sky an even gray, and the only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant tolling of a church bell. Inside the stone-walled chapel, with no audience but a trusted aide, a local officiant, and Margaret Kelvin seated near the front, Jessica Pascal stood in a soft cream dress, her curls loosely pinned and her heart trembling with quiet awe. Across from her stood Joshua, not as the President of the United States, but as a man utterly certain of the woman before him. The decision had come after weeks of gentle conversations and mutual reflection. Joshua understood what his life meant, how every move was scrutinized, every word parsed by press and public alike. But with Jessica, he had found a space untouched by noise. She didn't want power, and he didn't want pretense. They had discussed it one night under the soft glow of an embassy terrace lantern, what it would mean to build a life together. Jessica, still fragile from the scars Daniel left behind, had asked him only for one thing: protection, not publicity. Joshua agreed. The world didn't need to know right away. Their love was too sacred to be politicized. And so the wedding was arranged in secret, with no floral spectacle, no televised moment. Just a vow, a ring, and two people saying yes to a new beginning far away from judgment, scandal, and speculation. After the ceremony, they returned to a private estate not listed on any diplomatic itinerary. There was no press release, no official photo. The president's trip to Geneva was attributed to a summit debrief and humanitarian tour. Jessica's name was never mentioned. To the public, she remained unknown. But to Joshua, she was now his wife. She spent the next few days in quiet bliss, walking hand in hand with him through garden paths, dining by candlelight, and sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. There were no headlines, no obligations. Just freedom. She was no longer Jessica the cleaner, or Jessica the abandoned wife. She was Jessica Kelvin, beloved in silence, protected in secrecy. The world may not have known her name yet, but soon it would, and on her terms. Jessica Kelvin stepped off the private jet at a discreet airstrip outside Ottawa, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. The woman who had once scrubbed toilets in a gray uniform was now married to the most powerful man in the world, but not even the sharp-eyed customs agents would have known it. There was no motorcade, no flashing lights, no First Lady insignia. Just a single black car, a diplomatic tag, and a quiet convoy arranged by Joshua's closest security attaché. True to his word, Joshua had protected her identity fiercely. In public, he was still unmarried, a detail that gave them both peace for now. Jessica, now fluent in blending into the background, returned not to the embassy, but to a new residence hidden in plain sight, an elegant townhouse nestled between two government-owned buildings, guarded discreetly by Secret Service in civilian clothes. Her return wasn't idle. Joshua had entrusted her with a subtle but important role, managing the administration of his private philanthropic initiative in Canada, a discreet effort focused on education and women's rehabilitation. Jessica took on the responsibility with quiet diligence, organizing donation networks, coordinating community-based literacy events, and restructuring support groups for displaced women across several provinces. Her past gave her insight. She wasn't just creating systems, she was building hope, thread by thread. The public knew the charity as a U.S.-Canada diplomatic effort, unaware that the woman leading most of its work had once slept on a bench near Rue St. Hubert. Jessica traveled modestly, spoke sparingly, and always gave credit to others. The few who met her were struck by her humility and poise, but none knew who she truly was. Still, the shadows were not without weight. At times, Jessica struggled with her silence, the need to suppress her truth while the world still recognized her by her maiden name, if at all. Her emails were signed J. Pascal, her public appearances scripted to avoid personal questions, and her private life tucked carefully between layers of protocol. But in this quiet season, Jessica found purpose. She no longer wept at night. Her hands, once calloused from janitorial work, now held pens, wrote grants, and reshaped lives. And every evening, whether by secure video call or encrypted message, Joshua reached out, not as the president, but as her husband, reminding her that in a world of noise, their love would always remain a sanctuary. Jessica had returned to Canada not to disappear, but to rebuild, with strength forged in silence. The first tremor in Daniel Mark's empire came in the form of an unassuming brown envelope marked Urgent, Internal Revenue Service. He received it one morning in his downtown Vancouver penthouse, still nursing a hangover from a wine-soaked celebration with Annabelle the night before. At first, he dismissed it as routine, tossing it onto the dining table while adjusting his cufflinks for a Zoom meeting with international investors. But when his legal assistant called 2 hours later, her voice tight and panicked, the weight of the letter shifted. "There's a discrepancy, sir," she said. "Several discrepancies. Offshore accounts. Inconsistent statements. And someone reported a series of unusual transfers linked to Annabelle's firms." Daniel's chest tightened. He had always considered himself smart, but he'd grown careless, entrusting too much to Annabelle, who had taken over parts of their financial structuring under the guise of streamlining their power couple brand. Annabelle Briggs, now flaunting herself as Daniel's partner in both life and business, had expanded aggressively into real estate development, using Daniel's company as collateral for risky investments. She had promised him fast returns and international expansion. What Daniel hadn't realized was that she had also been laundering funds through dummy accounts and cutting corners with zoning permits. While he was busy playing the corporate prince, Annabelle had been manipulating his assets like chess pieces in a private game he didn't know he was losing. When the Canadian Federal Tax Board initiated a surprise audit, it didn't take long for their legal team to uncover fraudulent invoices, overstated valuations, and payments made to shell corporations registered under false names. Daniel tried to control the damage, but word spread quickly. His company, once a rising star in the tech-integrated marketing sector, was now under scrutiny. Within a month, 3 of his largest clients terminated their contracts. A pending partnership with a U.S. firm was suspended indefinitely. Headlines followed: Mark and Briggs empire under audit, rising stars company plunges amid investigation, and worst of all, questionable ties between executive couple and fraudulent holdings. Annabelle, ever the opportunist, began pulling away. She stopped answering calls, made vague statements to the press distancing herself from his decisions, and disappeared on a supposed retreat to Monaco. Daniel, once untouchable, now found himself standing on a crumbling foundation. As lawsuits loomed and investigators circled, he realized too late that the empire he'd built wasn't a fortress, it was a house of cards, held together by lies, arrogance, and the blind trust he gave to a woman who never truly loved him. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton in downtown Toronto glittered with opulence as Canada's top philanthropists, diplomats, and business leaders gathered for the annual Unity for Literacy Gala, a prestigious event held to raise funds for cross-border educational programs. Dressed in a black velvet tuxedo with a crimson pocket square, Daniel Mark walked through the entrance flanked by 2 acquaintances who still saw him as a social asset, despite the growing murmurs surrounding his business. He wore his trademark smirk, the one that masked desperation with arrogance. His empire might be teetering, but his ego remained unshaken. He was determined to use the evening to reassert his relevance, to reclaim some of the prestige he'd been rapidly losing. What he didn't expect was to come face to face with a ghost from his discarded past, one dressed in elegance, exuding quiet power. Jessica entered through a side entrance with the event's ambassadorial committee. She wore a sleek, midnight blue gown that hugged her figure with understated grace. Her makeup was soft but radiant, her posture poised. Few in the room knew her name, but eyes followed her. She moved like someone who belonged, without the need to announce it. To Daniel, the sight of her was jarring. He hadn't seen her in over a year. To him, she had vanished, a bitter afterthought, a used woman whom he had discarded in pursuit of greater things. But here she was, radiant and untouchable. Unable to resist, he sauntered toward her during a break in the speeches, his voice loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Well, he sneered, tilting his glass of champagne. I'm surprised they let second-hand merchandise into events like this. Gasps followed. A few people turned. Jessica did not flinch. She met his eyes without a flicker of emotion. Her silence unsettled him. He pressed on, chuckling to himself. I guess the charity must be desperate for volunteers these days. No one's lining up to marry a used woman, are they? The words hung in the air like poison. But Jessica remained calm, offering only the faintest smile before gently excusing herself to speak with the event's VIP guest who had just entered. That guest was President Joshua Kelvin, flanked by Secret Service, warmly greeted by dignitaries. Daniel's laughter faltered as he watched Jessica walk up to the president, who greeted her not with a handshake, but with a kiss to the cheek and a soft hand on her back. The room changed. Whispers erupted. Daniel's blood ran cold as cameras flashed and one sentence cut through the noise. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to reintroduce the First Lady of the United States, Mrs. Jessica Kelvin. The energy inside the ballroom shifted like a gust of wind through a house of cards. Conversations faltered. Champagne flutes froze midair. Every eye locked on Jessica as President Joshua Kelvin, stoic, regal in his tailored midnight suit, extended his hand toward her and addressed the stunned crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce you to my wife, Jessica Pascal Kelvin, First Lady of the United States. The announcement landed like thunder on marble floors. Camera flashes ignited the room in bursts. Whispers transformed into gasps. Socialites whispered into designer sleeves, journalists scrambled to grab quotes, and security instinctively formed a subtle perimeter. Jessica remained still, her posture graceful, her eyes sweeping the room with the quiet confidence of a woman who no longer had anything to prove. She didn't smirk. She didn't flinch. She simply nodded once and linked her arm with her husband's, no longer the girl in a clearance dress standing in shadows, but the woman beside power. Daniel Mark's face drained of color so fast it was almost theatrical. He stood immobilized, hand still holding a half-full glass of champagne that trembled at the rim. For a moment, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. This couldn't be his Jessica. Not the woman he'd once dismissed as unremarkable, not the woman whose name he'd signed off on in those cruel divorce papers, not the woman he had humiliated in Milan. And yet, there she was. Taller than he remembered, more radiant than he had ever allowed himself to see, and standing next to the very leader he had hoped to one day impress. The irony sliced deeper than any insult he had ever thrown at her. He tried to laugh, to deny, to explain it all away, but his knees buckled. Glass shattered on the floor as he collapsed into one of the velvet chairs behind him, eyes wide with panic. All around him, people whispered, "That's the woman he called barren. That's the woman he mocked." Joshua's security discreetly moved Jessica and the president toward the main stage, where the press pool, now alert and ravenous, had begun to circle. But Jessica paused. She turned slightly, not to gloat or to speak, but to glance at Daniel. Their eyes met. No words passed between them. But in that stare was everything, the hurt, the history, the humiliation, and her quiet triumph. Daniel, barely able to breathe, watched as the woman he once called second-hand ascended the stage with dignity the world couldn't ignore. He wasn't just witnessing a revelation, he was drowning in the consequences of his arrogance. And the world was watching. It began with a knock, firm, calculated, and final. At exactly 6:47 a.m., Daniel Mark opened the door of his luxury condo overlooking the Vancouver skyline to find two agents from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police standing on the threshold. Daniel Mark, one of them said, "You are under arrest for multiple counts of corporate fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes." He barely had time to process the words before cold steel clamped around his wrists. His protest was hoarse, his voice cracking as neighbors peeked through doors and blinds. Within minutes, the media had the footage. Daniel's name trended not for business accolades, but for betrayal and deceit. Investors he once courted abandoned him in a single afternoon. The empire he had built on polished shoes and empty ambition crumbled with brutal precision. All that remained were frozen accounts, criminal charges, and the reality of orange jumpsuits replacing his silk ties. Annabelle Briggs had vanished 2 days prior. The last anyone saw of her was security footage from Vancouver International Airport, her dragging 2 designer suitcases through a private terminal en route to the Cayman Islands. Authorities quickly uncovered her trail: falsified deeds, money laundering through luxury properties, and ghost transactions linked to dummy firms she created under Daniel's name. She had drained their last shared account, disappearing with the final funds while Daniel slept beside his buzzing phone. She left behind no note, no farewell. Only debt, criminal exposure, and a list of charges now tied to Daniel's name. As federal investigators combed through months of their business dealings, it became clear Daniel had not just been complicit. He had been careless, greedy, and willingly blind. The man who once boasted of his foresight had walked straight into ruin, led by his desire for prestige and possession. Jessica watched the arrest unfold on a muted screen in her Ottawa townhouse, her face calm as news anchors dissected the timeline. She sat alone, fingers curled around a porcelain teacup, her eyes fixed on the live footage. There was no smile, no glee, no triumph in her gaze, only a quiet stillness. Joshua stood nearby, saying nothing, understanding this wasn't a victory to be celebrated. Jessica hadn't wanted revenge. She had wanted peace. But fate had delivered justice in its own time. As Daniel was escorted into a holding van, cameras flashing and bystanders shouting, Jessica reached for the remote and turned off the television. She had no more tears for the man who broke her. No more anger for the mistress who mocked her. Just silence, and the knowledge that her story, once buried beneath shame, had risen without a single scream. The villa Annabelle Briggs rented on the outskirts of Tulum was everything she thought would soothe her nerves: secluded, extravagant, and buried in the dense Mexican jungle beyond the prying eyes of Western media. Its high bamboo walls shielded her from reporters, while the infinity pool gave her the illusion of control she desperately clung to. But behind the tinted glass windows and imported silk drapes, fear was a constant companion. Her empire had collapsed. Her name, once synonymous with luxury, was now whispered with contempt in every financial newsroom from Toronto to Los Angeles. Her accounts were frozen. Her passport had been flagged. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours in weeks. And worse, she knew it was only a matter of time before extradition orders closed in. Every creak of the floor, every ring of her burner phone, sent chills through her spine. Her desperation grew sharper when she realized she had no allies left. The same socialites who once invited her to yacht parties now pretended they'd never heard of her. Old clients ghosted her. Even the men she once manipulated for deals blocked her number. So she did the unthinkable: she tried to reach out to Jessica. From a burner account, Annabelle sent emails. "You don't know what it's like to be hunted. I never meant to hurt you. Please. Just talk to me." She left voice messages through embassy lines, using aliases. She even sent a handwritten letter, smuggled through a diplomatic courier who owed her a favor, pleading with Jessica for compassion. "I'm not the villain everyone thinks I am. You got your piece. Help me get mine." The woman who once scorned Jessica now begged her with shaking hands, terrified of what awaited. But Jessica never replied. Not a word. Not a glance. Not even acknowledgement. Her silence was deafening, colder than prison walls, sharper than any insult Annabelle had once hurled. Jessica's staff received the messages and deleted them without passing them along. Joshua was informed but never interfered. Jessica had made her position clear: some voices didn't deserve a second hearing. And so Annabelle remained in hiding, pacing her luxury prison, checking the windows, scrolling news sites for signs of arrest warrants. When the final warrant was issued and her name flashed across Interpol's red notice list, she stared at the screen in silence. No one was coming. Not Daniel. Not her lawyers. And certainly not Jessica Pascal Kelvin, the woman she once tried to erase, now untouchable, unshaken, and uninterested in mercy. The UN Women's Global Assembly in Geneva was always a grand affair, an annual summit drawing world leaders, human rights advocates, and global influencers. But this year, anticipation buzzed with unusual intensity. Rumors had swirled for weeks that the First Lady of the United States, whose identity had only recently been confirmed by official channels, would deliver the keynote address. The press speculated endlessly. No one had seen Jessica Pascal Kelvin give a public speech before. She had remained a quiet mystery, unseen, unassuming, and unbothered by attention. But now, seated beneath the crest of the United Nations emblem, the world watched as Jessica stepped up to the podium. Dressed in a minimalist pearl-white suit, her hair swept elegantly back, she looked both serene and formidable. When she began to speak, the room fell into a silence so thick it felt sacred. Her voice was calm, unhurried, each word landing with the weight of a truth long held back. "We often speak of strength as something loud," she said, eyes moving steadily across rows of ambassadors and dignitaries. "But I've learned that real strength often speaks in silence. It weathers humiliation, endures injustice, and still dares to rise, unannounced, uninvited, and undiminished." She did not name names. She didn't speak of her past directly, or the betrayal, or the public disgrace she endured. But the subtext was unmistakable. There are millions of women in this world who have been called too quiet, too plain, too broken. I stand here for them, not because I was louder, but because I refused to disappear. Her words rippled across the assembly like an invisible tide, pulling listeners into the heart of a story she never needed to spell out. When she finished, the applause began slowly, then rose into a thunderous standing ovation. Tears filled the eyes of diplomats. Journalists forgot their questions. Headlines were already being written. Jessica Pascal Kelvin stuns world stage. The First Lady of Silence speaks, strength redefined. That night, while cameras flashed and world leaders waited in line to shake her hand, Jessica moved with the same composure she always had. She didn't revel in the applause, she received it with quiet grace. And beside her stood President Joshua Kelvin, his hand lightly at the small of her back, pride evident but unspoken. Jessica was no longer just the woman the world had once overlooked. She had become its mirror, reflecting dignity not in defiance, but in stillness. And in doing so, she became a symbol not of survival, but of reverence. The letter arrived in a standard prison-issued envelope, folded 3 times and marked with a trembling hand. The handwriting, once confident and fluid, was now shaky, almost hesitant, as though Daniel Mark himself was unsure if he had the right to put pen to paper. Addressed to Mrs. Jessica Pascal Kelvin, the words inside were desperate, remorseful, and cloaked in a tone Daniel had never used with her before. "I see now how wrong I was," it began. "Not just in what I did, but in what I failed to see. You were never less. You were always more than I deserved." He wrote about regret, about long nights behind bars with nothing but silence and shame, about how he watched her UN speech through a prison TV and wept. He ended with a plea, not to love him again, not to return, but to forgive. "Please, Jessica. I don't ask for a second chance. I just ask not to live knowing I shattered something holy." Jessica read the letter once. No tears. No hesitation. Just a solemn nod, as though acknowledging the closing of a chapter she had already left behind. The weight of the words didn't pierce her, they floated, ineffectual, like dust in the air. She stood in her study for a moment, surrounded by books and silence, and then gently lowered the letter into the fireplace. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges into ash. She didn't watch it burn. She turned her back to it as it disappeared. No words were spoken. No reply was written. There were stories that needed no epilogue, only an end. Later that evening, the presidential ball shimmered with grandeur in the east wing of the White House. Dignitaries from over 40 nations filled the grand hall, the orchestra played a gentle overture, and gold chandeliers cast warm light over polished marble floors. All turned when Jessica entered the room. She wore a gown the color of moonlight, her shoulders bare, her expression serene. Her entrance wasn't dramatic, it was undeniable. Whispers rippled, "That's her. The First Lady who said nothing and changed everything." Joshua, waiting near the steps, extended his hand as she approached. She took it without pause, her eyes forward, her heart steady. As they descended the grand staircase together, Daniel's letter, and the pain it carried, was nothing more than ash. Jessica had risen. Not out of revenge. Not out of pride. But out of the dignity he once tried to take from her. And tonight, she danced in it. That's the end of the story. What did you learn about the story? Please leave a like and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories. Thanks for watching.